Hello and welcome back to another exciting video. So we moved a little bit farther ahead and now the last time we talked about if statements. I wish I had something better to draw, but we'll keep on using paint because not only is it fun, it's hilarious. Okay, so let's take a look at what we just did. So we talked about if statements that kind of look like this, right? So we have our conditional test. What happens if it's true, what happens if it's false. Then we talked about if statement that looks like this. So we have our question, what happens if it's true, and if it's not true, then it goes into let's check if this is true. Then from there, we could go on and have this is true, or this is false, or if we want, just like we checked here, possibly we could check here, and then just keep on going, right? So in this case, in this diagram, there would be 4 potential outcomes, right? So we'd have true, 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 and false. But I mean, like, it just depends what they are. So for example, if we had a soccer game and there could be win, tie, or loss, here it wouldn't be able to do that because it could either tell us if it's true, if it's a win, or if it's false, if it's a loss. If we have more options, we could do win, and if it's not a win, it could either be a tie or a loss and a tie or a win. It just doesn't matter the order, but it depends how many possibilities we have. In this case, if you look over here, we have a total of 4 possibilities. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. That gives you a good idea of what we're talking about. We're talking about nested if statements. This is a simple if statement. So we have our question, we have what happens if it's true, what happens if it's false. Here we have our question, if it's true, and then if it's false, it will then check these two, and so on. So let's take a look at a common example we have, especially because we're in school, of grading, right? So let's take a look at this. So if you want to get an A, you have to have over an 80, right? If you want to get a B, you have to have over 70. And let's say if you want to get a C, you have to get over 60. And if you want to get a D, you have to have over 50, and an F is anything that's under 50. Something like that, right? It's important to know that unless you set it up properly, if it says over 80, that will actually start counting from 81. We might want to use this symbol equals to, whoops, that didn't work at all. But we might want to use a symbol equals to or greater than instead of just equals to, because that's always going to count the number above. So in this case, D you actually get, if it's bigger than 50, that means D would count from 51, and F would only go to 49. That means that there are a few spots where the numbers aren't covered. But regardless, you get the idea. So let's take a look, and we have a student who got a 45. So we're going to basically check, is 45 bigger than 80, right? So our formula would be, is 45 greater than 80? Now, if it was true that 45 was bigger than 80, and again, that number could change as a variable, we'd give the student an A. Otherwise, we'd check the next one. So is 45 greater than 70? Now, is 45 greater than 70? If it's true, the person would get a B. Otherwise, we don't know. We check again. Next check is going to be, is 45 greater than 60? And if it is greater than 60, we'd give them a C. And let's say the only other option is, well, we actually draw it out. I'm just being lazy. So let's make this a little bigger. We'll go down here, and we'll draw a couple more boxes. Okay? So in our last check, we're going to take a look, and we're going to check, is 45 greater than 50? Now, if 45 is greater than 50, the person gets a D. But if it's none of these choices, it's not A, it's not B, it's not C, and it's not D, then the person would get an F, right? So we don't necessarily have to create a second branch, although we could, for the F. Basically, F means that no other possible criteria was met. Okay, so that's important to understand as we're narrowing down the data as we go forward. Okay, so that's how it would look. We just keep on testing it over and over again. Now, this statement would have a lot of stuff in it because we'd have to keep on nesting. And obviously, because we're opening up one bracket here, one bracket here, one bracket here, one bracket here, we'd have to have 4 closing brackets to make this work. So if it says an error about brackets, that's probably what's happening. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, if we want to figure out a faster way to do this, there's a lot of other strategies, because potentially you could have a zillion levels, and it might take a really long time to not only write the if statement and troubleshoot it, but also diagnose what's going on if it doesn't work, or change it in the future. So there are other strategies, but for now we're sticking with if statements. So the nested if statements the way it is right here. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. We've got an if statement, we've got a nested if statement. Now, let's go on to a new version. We're going to look at something called AND. So AND is we have our test. It actually works the same way as an if statement. And it has to be this guy and this guy. And let's say this guy. Okay, so we have something that looks like this. Now, we have our logical test. So for example, these are the possible outcomes, right? So we have AND, condition 1, condition 2, and so on, right? Now, if everything comes back as true, so this logical test and this logical test and this logical test are all true, then the whole thing becomes true. So let's put in some numbers. So let's say it looks like this. We're going to write equals and first we're going to have 5 equals 5. Then we're going to have 5 is greater than 10. And then here we're going to have 1 equals 1. And again, we could use cells or other kinds of reference and so on. Now, 5 does equal 5, and 1 does equal 1, but 5 is not greater than 10. Now, because everything is not true, the whole thing becomes false. Right? But if we got rid of this guy in the middle, and instead of this, we put in, I don't know, 5 is smaller than 10, right? Then the whole thing becomes true because all of its pieces are true. Okay, so we get rid of this, and we drop in true. Okay, so the whole thing becomes true. And in Excel, it's literally going to come out and tell you in the cell true or false. Now, we could go through and we could make that say something else, right? And we're going to look at an example of that in just a second from the textbook. Okay, so what I'm explaining is that this whole thing is called AND. Right? Now, we're going to look at a parallel structure, and this one is called OR. Now, OR works the exact same way. So let's draw a couple boxes, right? Like this. Now, what the test is going to be is, are all these things true? So let's put in some examples. We have 5 equals 5, and we have our 1 equals 1, and we have 5 is greater than 10, right? Now, this one is true, 5 does equal 5. This one is true, 1 does equal 1, but 5 is not greater than 10, but the whole thing is going to come back as true. Why? Because Excel is checking, are any one of the conditions inside true? This is checking, are all conditions true? This is checking if any one condition is true. If any one condition is true, so in this case we actually have 2 that are true, the 5 equals 5 and the 1 equals 1, it brings back the whole thing equals true. Now, the only other thing that you have to know, which gets really, really confusing, is that we could also do one more thing to the end here. And in our formula, we could write equals true. Or we could also write equals false. Right? And what that will do is, it's going to say if this whole thing comes back as false, then it would be true or false, right? So adding one level of complexity. So we can go back and actually, that's the way, like just like we could type in equals negative to change a number from a positive to a negative number, we could do the exact same thing when we're in this process as well by doing these formulas. Now, I want you to take a look at the truth table for AND at the bottom of page 85 in the 101 book, because that really tells you if it's true and true, you get a true. If it's true and false, you get a false, right? So it's very straightforward, exactly like we discussed it right here. Let's take a look at these examples. And we are doing, this is for formula number 46, which is whether it's checking whether condition 1 or 2 are met. So here we have an inventory item. It's just a bunch of text. This is the quantity, and this is the discount percentage, right? And basically what this is going to say is, it says if, and then it uses and, okay? And is looking at if from B3, which is here, the left 3 numbers, that's where the 3 is coming from, equals 202, and the mid 3 equals FIN, so it has to say, like this one, 202 and FIN. If both of them are true, then add 10%. This 10%, if we click on here, is going back to the value of true from the if statement. So this whole piece right here, all the way up till here, this whole thing is the logical test, right? It's checking two things. It's checking what are the left three numbers, do they equal 202? What are the middle three numbers, do they equal FIN? And together that equals a true or false. Now we have the two buckets over here. What happens if it's true, what happens if it's false? If it's true that these two conditions are met, write 10%. Otherwise, add 0% or write 0%. And then we drag them down and we get these numbers. Now remember that the discount is based only on this group of letters and numbers, the leftmost and the middle. It has nothing to do with the quantity. Okay, so let's look at that in our next section. So we broke it down here. Now here we just check true or false using left. So we say go to the left of this item and check whether it's true or false. So now, is it true that it equals 202? It's true, right? So we go B3, that's over here, check the three letters and see is it equal to 202, comes back as true. Now, is it final assembly, which gives the letters FIN? This middle one says PRT. So since PRT does not equal FIN, it's going to come back and say false. And then finally, we already saw our discount. Now here we just do it combined. So here we're basically combining, is this true and this false? So we're saying if and D3 comma E3, if they're both true because we use and, it would be 10%, otherwise it would be 0. Now, in this case, if we change the and to an or, it would come back and say it is true, it would put in 10%. Why? Because one of the conditions is true, right? If we put an and, it would come out as 0% because it's false, one of those things is false. But if we put an or, one of those things is true, it would default on the true side. So that's the basic idea of how and or differently. With and, we're checking to see if there's any one, if everything is true, and with or, we're looking to see if any one thing is true, and that will give us two very different results. So you should download this sheet and play around with it, and you could see how those work. Okay, now if you zip down to 47, it's going to show you the exact same thing that we were just looking at. If you look at discount, this time it's going to say if and with a nested or, left B3 is 202 and left B3 is 203 plus, so all of this part right here, this part is part of our or statement, right? Until here. Now, we could find out which brackets go with which brackets by comparing the colors. So the first one that we get is always black, the last one is always black. The and will go from the red one until the red one, right? The or is going to go from the purple until the purple, and so on, right? So that way you're able to figure out what level you're at and where they are. It also really helps, and I know it seems ridiculous, to actually draw them out and to make these diagrams. It really helps you figure out what exactly you're doing, what level are you on, what formula you're wrapped in at, and you can just dash those down on the table. It will make it a lot easier to use. Okay, so if you have those types of questions, it's able to put them together.